Stay quiet and don't move, the waitress mouthed to the Vampire King as she pressed a napkin to the table. Beneath it, scrawled in eyeliner, "Poison in your glass." His crimson eyes locked on hers for 3 heartbeats, but the sommelier who'd poured it was already cooling in the wine cellar with his throat torn open. And the woman who'd just saved him had 90 seconds before the kitchen manager discovered them both. Tessa Morgan balanced 4 dessert plates on her left arm and carried the wine bottle in her right hand, moving through the Obsidian Palace's main dining floor with the practiced efficiency of someone who had worked the vampire shift for 3 years straight. The black marble tables reflected candlelight like dark mirrors designed to hide what happened beneath their surfaces, and the silver candelabras overhead cast everything in cold light that made the crystal glassware gleam like weapons waiting to be drawn. She had served 1,000 glasses of wine to 1,000 vampires and never questioned any of them until tonight, until this one. Until the liquid caught the candlelight wrong, and she saw the shimmer, that same opalescent swirl she'd watched kill her roommate 2 years ago in a champagne flute she'd been too paralyzed to knock away. The shimmer moved like oil on water, iridescent and wrong. Bloodthorn poison. Elena's throat had closed in 40 seconds. Her lips had turned blue while Tessa screamed for help that came too late, at a gala full of vampires who'd ruled her death an unfortunate allergic reaction and made the whole thing disappear by morning. Tessa's hand trembled as she approached table 7. Lucien Vale sat alone in the corner booth, dark hair falling past his shoulders, dressed in black that made him look carved from the same marble as his restaurant. The Vampire King rarely dined in public, but when he did, he chose this table, positioned to see every entrance, every exit, every threat. Except he hadn't seen this one. She set the dessert plates down for the adjacent table with mechanical precision, then shifted to his booth. Her fingers brushed the silverware as if straightening it, leaning close enough that her hair fell forward, hiding her lips from the security cameras mounted in the corners. Stay quiet and don't move. His eyes found hers. Deep red, ancient, cataloging every micro-expression on her face in the space between heartbeats. She pulled the napkin from her apron pocket and pressed it flat beside his untouched wine glass, her hand covering the words she'd scrawled in the staff bathroom 30 seconds ago. The kitchen door banged open behind her. "Tessa." Head server Diane's voice cracked like breaking glass. "Cellar. Now." Every vampire in the dining room turned toward the sound. Tessa's pulse hammered in her throat as she stepped back from table 7, forcing herself to walk, not run, toward the kitchen entrance. Diane stood in the doorway, her face the color of old newspaper, one hand pressed to her mouth. The wine cellar stairs descended into cool darkness that smelled of oak barrels and something copper-sweet that made Tessa's stomach turn. Laurent lay crumpled at the bottom, his silver corkscrew still clutched in one hand. His throat opened in 3 savage lines that had nearly taken his head off. Blood pooled beneath him in a shape that looked almost deliberate, like someone had positioned the body for maximum effect. "Oh God," Diane whispered. "Oh God, Laurent." "Who?" "Get upstairs." Manager Rick's voice came from behind them, tight with the kind of control that meant he was seconds from losing it. "Both of you. Lock the kitchen. I'm calling the police." He checked his watch. Inventory check was scheduled for 90 seconds ago. Tessa's legs moved on autopilot, climbing back toward the kitchen. Through the service window, she could see the dining room. Table 7 was empty. The wine glass sat untouched, that telltale shimmer still visible if you knew what to look for. The napkin was gone. A hand closed around her wrist. Tessa spun to find a man built like a wall, dark suit, earpiece, the kind of blank professional face that meant private security. "Miss Morgan. Come with me, please. I'm working. Now." His grip didn't hurt, but it left no room for argument. He guided her through the prep kitchen, past the dishwashing station, into a private dining room she'd never been cleared to enter. The door closed behind them with a sound like a vault ceiling. Lucien Vale stood by the window, the napkin in his hand. He'd read it. Of course he'd read it. His bodyguard positioned himself between Tessa and the door, and she realized with sick clarity that she'd just interfered with vampire politics in a way that made her either a hero or a corpse. You wrote this. Lucien's voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of calm that preceded violence. Explain. The shimmer in your wine. Bloodthorn poison. It killed her throat closed. It killed someone I knew. 2 years ago. Same poison. His eyes narrowed, studying her with an intensity that felt like being dissected. The door opened again and another man entered, older, gray-haired, carrying a tablet that showed security footage. Sir, surveillance shows Miss Morgan approached your table alone at 11:47 p.m. No contact with kitchen staff prior to the warning. No accomplices visible. Lucien looked back at Tessa. You're telling me you saved my life because you recognized poison in my wine. I'm telling you someone tried to kill you tonight, and they murdered your sommelier to do it. Her voice steadied, anger burning through the fear. Laurent didn't pour that wine by accident. Something shifted in Lucien's expression. Not trust, not yet, but calculation. He pulled out his phone, typed something, then looked at his bodyguard. Silas. Stage an allergic reaction. Rash, difficulty breathing, the usual theater. Get the police focused on the body, not the wine. Kellen, he nodded to the gray-haired man. Make sure that glass disappears before anyone tests it. Silas moved to the door. What about the girl? Lucien's eyes never left Tessa's face. She comes with us. Kellen escorted her through corridors she'd never seen, service passages that connected the restaurant to a private garage where a black car idled with its engine running. Tessa climbed into the back seat because refusing felt like choosing a faster death. The door closed. The car moved. And she understood with perfect, terrible clarity that her normal life had just ended in the 90 seconds it took for a kitchen manager to find a body and a vampire king to decide she was worth keeping alive. The car delivered them to a townhouse in the historic district, the kind of building that predated the treaty by 2 centuries and looked like it had been designed to withstand sieges. Silas led Tessa through a marble entrance hall lined with portraits of men and women whose eyes seemed to follow her movements, then up a staircase that curved like a spine, and finally into a study that smelled of old leather and older secrets. Lucien stood behind a desk made of wood so dark it looked like petrified night. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves surrounded them, filled with volumes whose spines bore titles in languages Tessa didn't recognize. Kellen locked the door and positioned himself beside it, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Silas remained 2 steps behind Tessa, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating off him. Vampires always ran cold, like walking corpses wrapped in human skin. Sit. Lucien gestured to a chair positioned in front of the desk. Not a request. Tessa sat. Her uniform smelled like the kitchen, like garlic and wine and the copper-sweet wrongness of Laurent's blood. She'd killed a man once, accidentally, a drunk driver who'd run a red light while she was crossing. She'd watched him die through his windshield. This felt like that, like being pulled into consequences she hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. Lucien opened a drawer and removed a piece of glass no larger than his palm, wrapped in black silk. When he unwrapped it, the shard caught the lamplight and threw it back in colors that shouldn't exist in nature, violet bleeding into silver bleeding into a blue so deep it looked like drowning. True glass, he said. Forged 3 centuries ago by a vampire who believed lies were the only real poison. When you touch it, the glass shows me what you're hiding. Not your words, your truth. He placed it on the desk between them. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. You're going to answer with your hand on the glass. If you lie, I'll know. If you refuse, Silas will escort you somewhere you won't be found. Understood? Tessa's throat felt full of thorns. What if I tell the truth and you don't believe it? The glass doesn't care what I believe. It shows what is. His eyes held hers. First question, why did you warn me? She reached forward, her fingers trembling, and pressed her palm flat against the glass. It felt cold, then hot, then like touching water that had forgotten how to be wet. Because I couldn't save her, but I could save you. The glass rippled. Colors swirled beneath her hand like oil and water, then an image formed on its surface, clear as a photograph, moving like a memory played on repeat. Elena in her black cocktail dress, laughing at something Tessa had said, lifting a champagne flute at the Vampire-Human Relations Gala 2 years ago. The same opalescent shimmer in the liquid. Elena's expression shifting from joy to confusion to terror in the space of 3 heartbeats. Her throat closing. Her hands clawing at her neck. Tessa screaming, frozen, unable to move as her roommate convulsed and collapsed on the marble floor while vampires in tuxedos stepped back to give her room to die. Lucien's voice cut through the memory. Second question, how did you know it was poison? I watched it kill my roommate. Tessa's voice broke. The glass showed Elena's lips turning blue, showed the paramedics arriving too late, showed the vampire official in the gray suit who'd ruled it an unfortunate allergic reaction and had the body removed before the human press could make it complicated. Same shimmer. Same poison. I'd know it anywhere. The image in the glass dissolved into colors again, then reformed into something new, Elena's apartment. 3 weeks before she died, papers spread across the dining table. Legal documents. Case files. Elena's face serious, worried, pointing to a spreadsheet that showed names and dates. Something's wrong with these enforcement cases, Tessa. The numbers don't match. 28 authorized terminations in 2 years? For treaty violations? That's more than the previous decade combined. Third question. Lucien's voice had gone very quiet. Who sent you to warn me? No one sent me. Tessa's palm pressed harder against the glass. I saw the poison. I recognized it. I moved before I could think about why it was a stupid idea. The glass showed her in the bathroom, pulling the eyeliner from her apron, scrawling the warning on a napkin with hands that shook so badly she could barely form letters. Showed her walking back into the dining room with her heart hammering and her thoughts screaming at her to run, run, run. Showed her pressing the napkin onto the table because staying silent would make her the same as everyone who'd stayed silent when Elena died. The glass went dark. Lucien lifted it from the desk and rewrapped it in silk, his movements deliberate, controlled. When he looked up, something had shifted in his expression, not warmth, exactly, but a recalibration. Elena Vasquez. Legal aid to the Human Rights Council. Tessa's head snapped up. You knew her? I knew of her. She filed an inquiry about Enforcement Division practices 8 weeks before her death. He leaned back in his chair. 28 authorized terminations in 24 months. She wanted access to the case files to verify the charges. The request was denied on security grounds. 3 days later, she died at a public event. The inquiry disappeared. Her files were never found. Who runs your enforcement division? Tessa's voice came out flat, cold, the kind of calm that lived on the other side of rage. My second in command. Lord Magnus Thorne. Lucien's jaw tightened. I sign the authorizations based on his intelligence. Every execution is legal under treaty law. But if the intelligence is falsified, you're telling me your own government killed her? Tessa stood, the chair scraping back. She was a legal aide asking questions about numbers that didn't match, and someone murdered her with poison at a public gala and called it an allergic reaction, and you're just now figuring out you might have a problem? I'm telling you someone weaponized my laws, Lucien said, standing to meet her fury, and tonight they tried to kill me the same way they killed her. Which means Elena Vasquez found something worth dying for, and Laurent died trying to defect before he became the next body. He moved around the desk, closing the distance between them. 28 people dead in 2 years. How many were actually criminals? How many were witnesses like Elena who asked the wrong questions? Tessa's hands curled into fists. What was she investigating? I don't know. But Magnus does. Lucien looked at Kellen. Pull every authorization I've signed in the past 3 years. Cross-reference with Enforcement Division case files. I want names, dates, original charges. Kellen nodded and left the room, his footsteps disappearing down the hall. Silas spoke for the first time since they'd entered the study. Sir, if Magnus is behind this, if he's orchestrating a coup, the girl is a liability. She's seen the glass. She knows about Elena's inquiry. If word reaches Magnus that she's here, then we keep her here. Lucien's eyes never left Tessa's face. You wanted to save someone tonight. Congratulations. Now you're going to help me figure out who's been murdering people in my name, starting with your roommate. He paused. Unless you'd prefer to go home and pretend this never happened. I can arrange that. You'll wake up tomorrow with no memory of any of this, and you'll die in a car accident within a week because Magnus doesn't leave loose ends. Tessa thought of Elena's papers spread across their dining table, thought of her friend's worry that something was deeply wrong with the system they were supposed to trust. Thought of 2 years spent carrying guilt for not knocking that champagne glass out of her hand, for not asking the right questions, for not being brave enough to make noise when silence was safer. I want to know what she found, Tessa said. I want to know who killed her. And I want them to pay for it. Lucien's expression didn't change, but something in his posture relaxed, a predator recognizing an ally instead of prey. Then you're going to need to survive until morning. Kellen will have the files in 3 hours. Until then, you stay here, you don't contact anyone, and you understand that the moment you stepped into my car, you became part of vampire politics in a way most humans don't survive. I stopped surviving the night Elena died, Tessa said. Tonight, I'm just catching up. The vault door opened with a sound like teeth grinding against bone, revealing a room that smelled of cold metal and older blood. Tessa followed Lucien down steps that descended into darkness until motion sensors triggered overhead lights, fluorescent and harsh, the kind designed to prevent shadows from hiding anything important. The space stretched wider than she'd expected, walls lined with filing cabinets that gleamed like surgical instruments, each drawer labeled with years that stretched back before she was born. Lucien moved to the wall on the left, pulling open drawers with mechanical precision, extracting manila folders that looked thin and innocent in his hands. He spread them across the steel table in the center of the room, 28 files arranged in chronological order like evidence at a crime scene. Each folder bore the same red stamp, authorized by order of the king. These are the terminations Magnus brought me, Lucien said, his voice flat in the way that meant he was working very hard to keep it that way. Every execution requires my signature under treaty law. Magnus presents the intelligence. I review the evidence. If the threat is credible, I authorize the Enforcement Division to proceed. He opened the first file, dated 23 months ago. Victor Molnar. Charged with operating an illegal feeding house. 3 human victims died from exsanguination. Evidence included witness testimony, physical evidence, surveillance footage. Tessa leaned over the file, scanning the documentation. It looked legitimate. Witness statements, medical examiner reports, time-stamped video showing a man matching Victor's description entering a warehouse with human victims who never left alive. This one looks real. Most of them are. Lucien moved through the files with practiced efficiency, sorting them into 2 piles. 19 in one stack, 9 in the other. These 19 were actual criminals. Vampires who violated the treaty in ways that threatened the entire peace accord. Rogue feeders. Black market blood dealers. The kind of predators who make humans afraid to trust any of us. He touched the smaller pile, 9 folders that looked identical to the others, but somehow carried more weight. These 9 weren't. Tessa picked up the first file from the smaller stack. Alejandra Santos. Legal secretary at the Human Advocacy Center. Charged with disseminating classified treaty information to unauthorized parties. The evidence looked thin. Email logs that could have meant anything, witness testimony from a single source within the Enforcement Division, no physical proof of actual wrongdoing. The authorization order bore Lucien's signature at the bottom, black ink that looked like a death sentence. She was documenting Enforcement Division overtime reports, Tessa said, reading the background notes that Magnus had buried in the appendix. Why would that require termination? It wouldn't. Unless those overtime reports showed enforcement agents working off-book operations. Lucien opened another file. Michael Chin, environmental inspector who noticed industrial shipping containers being moved through the port without proper documentation. Marcus Webb, transit authority clerk who flagged irregularities in passenger manifests. Sarah Kim, forensic accountant who questioned budget discrepancies in the Enforcement Division's quarterly reports. He looked up, his eyes dark with something that might have been rage or guilt or both. They were all asking the wrong questions. They were all murdered as threats to treaty security. And I signed every authorization based on Magnus' falsified evidence. Tessa's hands shook as she reached for the file she knew would be there. Elena Vasquez. The folder felt heavier than the others, thicker, as if Magnus had worked harder to make this one look legitimate. She opened it and saw her roommate's face staring back from an identification photo, Elena smiling, professional, wearing the same expression she'd worn every morning when she left for work, convinced she was making the world slightly better. The charges made her stomach turn. Subject observed unauthorized access to Enforcement Division records. Exhibits pattern of information gathering consistent with espionage activities. Recommends immediate termination under Section 7, threat to treaty security. Keep reading, Lucien said quietly. Tessa flipped through Magnus' intelligence report, through witness statements from enforcement agents who claimed Elena had been asking suspicious questions, through surveillance logs that showed her entering restricted areas of the government building after hours. Then she found the appendix, the actual evidence Magnus had buried beneath layers of manufactured suspicion. Transportation logs. Shipping manifests. Financial records showing payments to vampire nests in territories outside treaty jurisdiction. Elena had documented everything: routes moving humans from treaty cities to rogue enclaves, safe houses where victims were held before transport, wire transfers that paid off corrupt officials to look the other way. She'd found Magnus' operation, mapped it with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was the only weapon that mattered. He was trafficking humans, Tessa whispered, the words catching in her throat. Magnus was moving people to vampire nests outside treaty protection, selling them to rogue feeders who don't follow any laws. And Elena found the proof. Lucien pulled another file from the cabinet, this one marked with Laurent's name. Your sommelier worked in Magnus' division for 3 years before transferring to the restaurant last month. According to his personnel file, he requested reassignment after witnessing irregularities in enforcement operations. Magnus approved the transfer. He opened the file, revealing internal memos that showed Laurent had submitted a formal complaint about falsified evidence 2 weeks before his death. He was trying to defect. He knew about the poisoning attempt. Magnus silenced him and staged it to look like an external attack on me. Tessa's vision blurred. She thought of Elena spreading those papers across their dining table, worried about numbers that didn't match, determined to follow the evidence wherever it led because that's what good people did when systems failed. She thought of her roommate dying on a marble floor surrounded by vampires who'd stepped back to give her room to convulse, thought of 2 years spent believing Elena had been killed by bad luck instead of deliberate murder. Her fist hit the vault wall before she realized she'd moved. Steel rang like a bell, pain exploding across her knuckles, blood smearing against metal that had probably witnessed worse violence, but never more justified. She was just doing her job. The scream tore out of her throat, raw and broken. She was just trying to save them. She was documenting evidence so people would know what was happening, and she spun to face Lucien, tears streaming down her face, her hand throbbing. You signed the order that killed her. You murdered my friend because you didn't bother to verify Magnus' lies. Lucien didn't flinch, didn't defend himself, didn't offer excuses that would have made her angrier. He stood there holding Elena's file with both hands, looking at her photo like he was memorizing a debt he could never repay. "I know," he said, and his voice carried the weight of 28 bodies he'd authorized without questioning whether the evidence was real. "I trusted my second-in-command. I believed the system worked because I built it to work." And Magnus weaponized that trust to murder anyone who threatened his operation. He set the file down carefully, his hands steady in the way that meant he was holding himself together through pure force of will. "Elena Vasquez died because I failed to do my job. Laurent died trying to fix my mistake. And 9 other people were executed because I signed their death warrants without asking the right questions." Tessa's rage collapsed into something colder, sharper, more useful than grief. She looked at the files spread across the table, at the evidence of a conspiracy that had murdered her friend and built itself on a king's blind trust. Looked at Lucien standing there carrying guilt that matched her own, her failure to knock away a champagne glass, his failure to verify the truth before signing execution orders. "Then we make him pay for all of them," Tessa said, her voice steady now, frozen into something that felt like purpose. "We find every piece of evidence Elena gathered. We document every human Magnus trafficked. We build a case that can't be buried or dismissed or explained away." She met Lucien's eyes. "And when we have enough proof to destroy him, we make sure everyone knows exactly what he did and who let him do it." Lucien nodded once, the gesture carrying the weight of a king accepting responsibility for his kingdom's failures. "Then we'd better work fast. Magnus knows Laurent is dead. He'll move against us as soon as he realizes the poisoning failed." He gathered the files, stacking them with careful precision. "We have until morning to find everything Elena hid. After that, we're at war." The safe house smelled like old stone and older magic, the kind of building that had survived wars by being too stubborn to burn. Tessa sat at a table scarred with knife marks while Silas paced the perimeter, checking windows that had been bricked over decades ago, testing doors that opened into rooms she couldn't see. Lucien stood by the fireplace, speaking in low tones with Kellen, their conversation punctuated by the kind of silence that meant bad news delivered in careful increments. "For hours until dawn," Silas said, checking his watch with the precision of someone who measured time in survival intervals. "Conclave convenes at first light. Magnus called the emergency session 3 hours ago, using his authority as second-in-command." He looked at Tessa with an expression that might have been sympathy if vampires bothered with such things. "You understand what conclave is?" Tessa shook her head, her bruised knuckles throbbing where she'd punched the vault wall. 15 vampire lords. The oldest families. They vote on succession disputes, treaty violations, matters of governance that can't be resolved through normal channels. Silas moved to the table, spreading out a diagram that showed a circular chamber with 15 seats arranged like a jury box. "Magnus is calling for Lucien's removal as king on grounds of compromised judgment regarding humans. He'll present evidence that Lucien trusted a human witness over vampire intelligence, that he's acting irrationally, that his leadership threatens treaty stability." "He's staging a coup," Tessa said flatly. "He's following legal procedure." Lucien crossed the room, his footsteps silent on stone that should have echoed. "Conclave law allows any senior vampire to challenge a king's fitness to rule if they can demonstrate cause. Magnus has 6 lords already committed to his position. He needs 8 of 15 votes to depose me." He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward until his face was level with hers. "You're going to testify. You're going to tell them what you saw in that wine glass, what Elena found, what Magnus has been doing with his trafficking operation. But human witnesses don't survive conclave chambers without protection." Tessa's throat went dry. "What kind of protection?" "Blood mark of the royal witness." Lucien straightened, pulling a small wooden box from his coat pocket. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a vial of dark liquid and a silver needle thin as a hair. "It's a ritual that marks you as my instrument. My blood mixed with powdered silver, inscribed on your throat in a pattern that grants temporary immunity in vampire spaces. 48 hours of protection. Long enough to testify and survive the aftermath. What's the catch? Tessa's voice came out steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. The catch, Silas said, his tone carrying the weight of someone delivering a death sentence, is that the mark makes you visible. Every vampire in that chamber will sense your connection to Lucien. You'll be a walking target for Magnus' allies. And if Lucien loses the throne, he paused, glancing at Lucien before continuing. If Magnus wins the vote, the blood mark becomes evidence of treason. You'll be classified as a compromised witness, subject to immediate execution under treaty law. Tessa thought about Elena dying on a marble floor, about Laurent bleeding out in a wine cellar, about 9 people murdered because they'd asked inconvenient questions. Thought about spending the rest of her life wondering if silence would have kept her safe or just made her complicit in the next murder Magnus orchestrated. Do it, she said. Lucien opened the vial, pouring dark liquid that looked black in the firelight into a small silver dish. He added powder from a second container, stirring with the needle until the mixture began to glow with a light that seemed to come from somewhere other than the fire. This will hurt, he said quietly, but it will also protect you. The mark burns like ice. Some humans pass out from the pain. If you need to scream, scream. No one here will judge you for it. Tessa tilted her head back, exposing her throat in a gesture that felt like surrender and defiance braided together. Lucien's fingers touched her jaw, positioning her at the angle he needed, and she felt the cold radiating off him. Vampires always ran cold, corpses animated by something that wasn't quite life. The needle touched her skin just below her ear, and the world turned to silver-blue fire. It felt like being branded from the inside out, ice so cold it became heat, burning through layers of skin and muscle and straight into the places where her pulse hammered against her throat. Lucien worked with steady precision, drawing the crescent pattern that curved from below her ear down to her collarbone, each stroke of the needle carrying liquid fire that made her vision blur and her hands clench against the table's edge. She didn't scream. Some stubborn part of her refused to give Magnus the satisfaction even though he wasn't there to hear it, but tears streamed down her face and her breath came in gasps that sounded like broken sobs. The needle lifted. The burning continued, intensifying until Tessa thought her throat might split open from the inside. Then the mark began to glow, silver-blue light visible even through her closed eyelids, and the pain shifted into something else, not comfort, exactly, but awareness. She could feel Lucien's presence like a weight in the room, could sense Silas and Kellen positioned at their respective stations, could feel the age of the building pressing down from above like history made solid. Done. Lucien's voice came from somewhere far away. The mark will fade in 48 hours. Until then, you're under royal protection. Any vampire who harms you answers directly to me. Tessa opened her eyes, touching her throat with trembling fingers. The skin felt hot, raised in ridges that formed the crescent pattern, glowing faintly in the dim light like a scar made of moonlight. I can feel you, she whispered, the words coming without thought. I can feel where you are in the room. That's the bond. It works both ways. I'll know if you're in danger. Lucien stepped back, and she felt the distance like a string pulled taut between them. But so will every other vampire who gets close enough to sense it. Magnus' allies will see you as leverage. Stay close to Silas at all times. The door opened and Kellen entered carrying a phone sealed in an evidence bag. Laurent's mobile. Recovered from the crime scene before the police processed it. He placed it on the table, pulling up an encrypted message thread that showed text exchanges between Laurent and Magnus dating back 3 weeks. He was feeding Magnus intelligence about Lucien's movements, about vulnerabilities in palace security. But look at the last message. Sent tonight at 11:32 p.m., 15 minutes before Tessa approached the table. Tessa leaned forward, reading words that made her blood turn cold. She recognized the shimmer. Eliminate Waitress before testimony. Magnus knew you saw the poison, Lucien said quietly. Laurent was supposed to kill you after dealing with me. 2 bodies, 1 night. Clean ending. He looked at Kellen. What's the count on conclave votes? 6 confirmed for Magnus. 5 confirmed for you. 4 undecided. Kellen pulled up profiles on his tablet, showing faces that looked carved from marble and malice. The undecided lords are waiting to see evidence. They're old enough to remember when kings were deposed for less than compromised judgment. They'll vote based on which side looks stronger, which argument threatens treaty stability less. For lords holding the balance of power, Silas said. We need at least 3 of them to break our way. Tessa stood, her legs steady despite the fire still burning in her throat. The blood mark pulsed with each heartbeat, glowing brighter when she moved closer to Lucien, dimming slightly when she stepped away. Then I'd better make my testimony count. Because I'm not dying in a vampire court while Magnus walks away from trafficking humans and murdering my friend. She met Lucien's eyes. You said I'm your instrument now. So use me. Put me in that chamber and let me tell them exactly what Magnus has been doing with your signatures. Lucien's expression shifted into something that might have been respect if kings admitted such things about human waitresses who'd saved their lives with warnings written in eyeliner. You understand you're a chess piece now. You're visible, marked, targeted. Magnus will do everything he can to discredit you before you speak. Good, Tessa said, touching the glowing crescent on her throat. Let him try. I've been invisible for 2 years while carrying guilt for Elena's death. Tonight, I'm done hiding. The mark flared brighter, responding to a resolve like it recognized something worth protecting. If I'm going to die anyway, I'm making sure everyone knows why. The sanctum rose from the historic district like a monument to violence wrapped in prayer, converted cathedral with walls of black stone shot through with silver veins that caught the pre-dawn light and threw it back in cold fragments. Gargoyles perched at the corners, not decorative, Tessa realized as they passed beneath, but functional guards whose stone eyes tracked movement with unsettling precision. The doors stood 20 feet tall, carved with scenes that depicted treaties signed in blood and wars ended with surrender. Silas opened them without touching the handles, some vampire trick that made the massive slabs of wood swing inward on hinges that didn't creak despite their obvious age. The interior smelled of incense and iron, high vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows that the candlelight couldn't reach. 15 chairs arranged in a semicircle around a central platform of white marble, each seat occupied by a figure who looked carved from the same stone as the building itself, ancient, immovable, watching with eyes that had witnessed centuries pass like seasons. Tessa counted the humans standing behind each vampire lord, retinues dressed in formal attire that looked like armor disguised as evening wear. Assistants, translators, witnesses to ensure treaty law was followed. But none of them stood on the testimony platform. According to Silas, no human had testified before conclave in 80 years, not since the last treaty renegotiation when human representatives had demanded legal protections that vampires had grudgingly accepted. Lord Magnus Thorne sat in the 3rd seat from the left, dressed in midnight blue velvet that made him look like aristocracy instead of a murderer. He had the kind of face that inspired trust, strong jaw, silver hair swept back from a high forehead, eyes that projected concern and reason in equal measure. When he stood to address the chamber, his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being believed. My lords, Magnus began, his tone measured, almost sorrowful. I invoke emergency conclave with a heavy heart. Lord Lucien Vale has served as our king with distinction for 3 decades. But recent events demonstrate a troubling pattern, judgment compromised by human sympathies that threaten the stability we've worked so hard to maintain. He gestured toward Lucien with what looked like genuine regret. Evidence. He harbors a human waitress who witnessed his own security chief's catastrophic failure to prevent an assassination attempt. Rather than conducting proper investigation, he has elevated this woman to protected status based on emotional response rather than security protocols. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, Vampire lords leaning toward their human attendants whispered conversations that sounded like wind moving through a graveyard. Tessa stood 2 steps behind Lucian, feeling the blood mark on her throat pulse with each heartbeat, aware that every vampire in the room could probably sense it glowing beneath her collar. Furthermore, Magnus continued, warming to his argument, Lord Lucian has made accusations of internal treason without presenting evidence to proper oversight channels. He has weaponized grief and human tragedy to cast suspicion on loyal members of his government. He paused, letting silence settle like dust. This behavior suggests a king who has lost the capacity for objective judgment, who prioritizes human emotional attachment over vampire security, who represents a liability to treaty stability at a time when we can afford none. A vampire lord in the front row, elderly even by their standards, skin like parchment stretched over ancient bone, raised one hand. Lord Magnus, you move for removal based on compromised judgment. What remedy do you propose for the human witness? Magnus' expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy if Tessa hadn't seen Elena's file. The waitress is clearly suffering from trauma. Emotional compromise following the loss of her roommate, the violence she witnessed tonight. I move for her removal from these proceedings under doctrine of emotional instability. We can arrange therapeutic intervention, memory modification if necessary. Humane solutions that serve her well-being and our security. The words landed like a trap closing. Remove Tessa, bury the testimony, control the narrative. Tessa felt rage building in her chest, felt the blood mark flare brighter in response to her fury. Lucian's voice cut through the murmurs before they could build into consensus. I invoke the ancient right of royal witness testimony in cases of internal treason. The chamber went silent. The elderly vampire lord leaned forward, eyes narrowing. That right hasn't been invoked in 2 centuries. It requires formal bloodmark ceremony and grants the witness immunity for duration of testimony. You would mark a human as your instrument before conclave. I already have. Lucian turned to Tessa, gesturing for her to step forward onto the testimony platform. Show them. Tessa's legs moved on autopilot, carrying her from the shadows behind Lucian's position to the white marble circle at the chamber's center. 15 vampire lords watched with the kind of attention predators gave to prey that had wandered into striking distance. She reached up with steady hands, steadier than they had any right to be, and pulled down her collar, exposing the crescent mark that glowed silver blue in the candlelight. The reaction rippled through the chamber like a stone dropped in still water. Human attendants stepped back involuntarily. Vampire lords stood for better viewing. Someone produced a camera, documenting the mark with clinical precision, the flash making Tessa's vision blur. A clerk moved forward with a leather-bound record book, noting the time, the witness, the formal invocation of protection that made her untouchable for the duration of her testimony. Magnus' carefully constructed sympathy cracked at the edges. He's chosen a human over vampire security protocols, he said, voice carrying through the chamber with calculated shock. My lords, this is precisely the compromised judgment I'm describing. A waitress, a traumatized civilian with no intelligence training, no security clearance, has been elevated to royal witness based on a single warning. This isn't protection. This is obsession. This is evidence, Lucian countered, his voice cold enough to freeze the incense smoke. Royal witness testimony is reserved for cases where internal treason requires human perspective to establish truth. Miss Morgan didn't just warn me of poisoning. She recognized the method. She connected it to a pattern of murders your enforcement division has been conducting for 2 years. He paused, letting the accusation settle. And she's prepared to testify about what she found in your files. The chamber erupted in voices, vampire lords demanding clarification, Magnus' faction calling for order, undecided lords exchanging glances that meant they were recalculating their positions based on new information. Kellen leaned close to Tessa, his whisper barely audible over the chaos. Every vampire here now knows you're his weakness. Magnus will aim everything at you. Tessa looked out at the 15 vampire lords, at Magnus standing with his carefully constructed concern sliding into something colder, at the human attendants watching her with expressions that ranged from sympathy to fear to something that might have been recognition, the understanding that she'd just done something most humans didn't survive. She thought of Elena documenting trafficking routes alone in their apartment, thought of Laurent dying in a wine cellar trying to defect, thought of 2 years spent invisible while carrying guilt for not being brave enough to make noise when silence was safer. "Let them aim," Tessa said, her voice carrying across the chamber with clarity she didn't know she possessed. The blood mark flared brighter, responding to her defiance, broadcasting her connection to Lucien like a beacon. "I spent 2 years being invisible while my friend was murdered for asking questions. Tonight, everyone gets to hear the answers she found." The elderly vampire lord who'd questioned Magnus raised his hand again, commanding silence that fell like a curtain. "The witness will testify. Lord Magnus, you will have opportunity for rebuttal. But royal witness testimony cannot be dismissed on grounds of emotional compromise once the mark is given and recorded." He looked at Tessa with eyes that had probably watched empires rise and fall. "Speak carefully, human. Lies before conclave carry penalties most of your kind don't survive." Tessa touched the glowing crescent on her throat, feeling Lucien's presence behind her like an anchor in deep water. "I don't need to lie," she said. "The truth is bad enough." The judgment mirror stretched across the floor beneath Tessa's feet, 25 feet of circular glass, so perfectly polished it looked like standing on frozen water. She could see her reflection staring back, pale face, glowing throat mark, eyes that looked older than they had 4 hours ago. The vaulted ceiling rose into darkness above, and somewhere in those shadows she could feel the weight of centuries watching, waiting to see if a human waitress could speak truth to power without breaking. "Tell them what you saw," Lucien said from his position at the chamber's edge, his voice carrying the formal cadence of conclave procedure. Tessa took a breath that tasted like incense and fear. 2 years ago, I watched my roommate die at a vampire-human relations gala. Elena Vasquez, legal aid to the Human Rights Council. She was drinking champagne when her throat started to close. 40 seconds from first sip to collapse. Her lips turned blue while I screamed for help that came too late. The words came easier than she'd expected, muscle memory from 2 years of replaying the scene in nightmares. The official ruling was allergic reaction. But I saw the shimmer in her glass, opalescent, moving like oil on water. Bloodthorn poison. The same shimmer I saw tonight in the wine glass meant for Lord Lucien. She looked up at the 15 vampire lords arranged in their semicircle, meeting eyes that reflected candlelight like polished stone. Elena spent 8 weeks before her death investigating Enforcement Division practices. She found a pattern: 28 authorized terminations in 24 months, more than the previous decade combined. She filed an inquiry requesting access to case files. The request was denied on security grounds. 3 days later, she died at a public event. Her inquiry disappeared. Her files were never found. Lucien moved to the chamber's center, activating screens that descended from the ceiling like electronic ghosts. The vault files appeared in high definition, 28 folders arranged chronologically, each bearing the red stamp of royal authorization. "These are the terminations Lord Magnus presented for my signature. I reviewed his intelligence. I authorized enforcement action based on evidence he provided." The screen shifted, showing side-by-side comparisons. 19 files in one column, thick with documentation, witness statements, surveillance footage, physical evidence of treaty violations. 9 files in the other column, noticeably thinner, relying heavily on single-source intelligence from Magnus Division. 19 were legitimate criminals, Lucien continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone admitting failure. Rogue feeders. Black market operators. Vampires who threatened treaty stability. But these 9, he highlighted the smaller column, had no criminal history. They were legal secretaries, transit clerks, environmental inspectors, forensic accountants. Human professionals who asked questions about Enforcement Division operations. Tessa stepped forward, pulling documentation from the folder Kellen had prepared. Alejandra Santos documented overtime reports showing enforcement agents working off-book operations. Michael Chen noticed shipping containers moving through ports without proper documentation. Sarah Kim questioned budget discrepancies that didn't match official records. She looked directly at Magnus, who sat motionless in midnight blue velvet, his expression carved from the same marble as the testimony platform. Elena found what they were all seeing pieces of: transportation logs moving humans between cities without legal authorization, trafficking routes, safe houses, wire transfers paying corrupt officials. Magnus was selling humans to rogue vampire nests outside treaty jurisdiction. Magnus stood with the kind of controlled movement that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. My lords, I protected vampire society from humans who would have exposed operations essential to our security. That is my mandate as enforcement director. Some intelligence requires compartmentalization. Some threats require preemptive action. His voice carried conviction that sounded almost reasonable. Elena Vasquez was documenting classified security protocols. Michael Chen was investigating border operations he had no clearance to access. These weren't innocent civil servants, they were security risks who would have compromised vampire sovereignty under the guise of human rights advocacy. The strategic trap clicked into place with brutal elegance. Magnus wasn't denying the kills. He was reframing them as necessary security measures, appealing to the vampire lord's instinct for self-preservation over human rights. Tessa pulled Lauren's phone from her pocket, the evidence bag crinkling in the silence. Laurent transferred from Magnus' division last month. He submitted a formal complaint about falsified evidence 2 weeks before his death. Magnus approved the transfer, then ordered his execution. She read from the recovered messages, her voice steady. Text sent tonight at 11:32 p.m. She recognized the shimmer. Eliminate Waitress before testimony. She looked up. Laurent was supposed to kill me after poisoning Lord Lucien. 2 bodies, 1 night. But Laurent had already decided he couldn't be part of the operation anymore. The screens changed again, showing Laurent's defection note recovered from his encrypted files. The words appeared in stark white text against black background. I can't be part of the trafficking anymore. The humans aren't criminals, they're merchandise. Magnus is selling them to nests in the disputed territories. I have documentation of 47 transports over 18 months. I'm ready to testify if granted protection. The chamber erupted in voices. Lady Isadora, a vampire lord with iron gray hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd survived more purges than most kingdoms experienced, leaned toward Lord Chen, a smaller figure whose expensive suit couldn't disguise the predatory stillness beneath. They exchanged glances that meant calculations were being recalibrated in real time. Magnus' voice cut through the chaos. I call for immediate deposition vote. Lord Lucien's judgment is compromised beyond recovery. He has elevated human testimony over vampire security protocols. He has weaponized grief and isolated incidents to manufacture conspiracy. If the crown remains in his hands, vampire sovereignty will be subordinated to human oversight. He paused, looking at each lord in turn. And I remind the conclave that all of Lord Lucien's acts, including the blood mark protecting this witness, become void upon deposition. Vote to preserve vampire authority. Vote to restore proper hierarchy. The threat hung in the air like smoke from extinguished candles. If Lucien lost the crown, Tessa's protection evaporated. She became a compromised witness with knowledge of internal vampire politics. Subject to immediate execution under the same laws Magnus had weaponized for 2 years. The elderly vampire lord who'd questioned Magnus earlier raised both hands, commanding silence that fell like a physical weight. Conclave will vote on deposition of Lord Lucien Vale on grounds of compromised judgment. Those in favor of removal signify by standing. 7 vampire lords stood. Magnus confirmed faction, moving with synchronized precision that suggested the votes had been secured long before testimony began. Those opposed to removal. 5 lords remained seated, Lucian's confirmed supporters holding their ground despite evidence that their king had signed execution orders based on falsified intelligence. Abstentions. 2 lords stood slowly, Lady Isadora and Lord Dimitri, an isolationist who looked like he'd been carved from winter itself. Their expressions gave nothing away, but their refusal to vote either direction meant Magnus was 1 vote short of the 8 he needed. 7 for removal. 5 against. 2 abstentions. 15 lords, and the throne hung in the balance of 1 vote. Magnus' carefully constructed reason cracked at the edges. The abstentions must choose. Vampire law requires clear majority for deposition. We cannot leave this chamber in deadlock while a compromised king holds power. Lady Isadora's voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched kingdoms rise and fall. Then perhaps the conclave requires additional evidence. The witness has presented documentation of systematic misconduct. Lord Magnus has framed his actions as security measures. But security measures require security threats, not merchandise. She looked at Tessa standing on the judgment mirror, glowing blood mark visible to every vampire in the chamber. I move for Lord Magnus to provide evidence that the humans he terminated were actual threats rather than convenient obstacles to profitable trafficking. The chamber fell silent. Magnus stood motionless, his midnight blue velvet suddenly looking less like aristocracy and more like costume. Because if he provided evidence, it would be falsified and subject to scrutiny. And if he couldn't provide evidence, his entire defense collapsed into exactly what Tessa had accused him of: murder for profit disguised as security protocol. Tessa felt the blood-mark pulse against her throat, felt Lucian's presence behind her like an anchor. The truth was bad enough. Now everyone was hearing it. The chamber doors opened with a sound like bone breaking. Kellen entered carrying a steel case that caught the candlelight and threw it back in sharp angles, the kind of container designed to preserve evidence that might decompose or disappear if handled carelessly. He moved the testimony platform with the precision of someone who delivered bad news to powerful people before and survived by being methodical about it. Forensic analysis from the wine cellar, Kellen said, placing the case on the judgment mirror beside Tessa's feet. He opened it to reveal a coil of silver wire so thin it looked like thread, stained dark at both ends. Laurent was killed with a garrote. Silver wire, specifically. This method requires vampire strength and leaves a signature pattern in the tissue damage, 3 parallel cuts that nearly decapitate the victim. He pulled out photographs that made Tessa's stomach turn, clinical documentation of Laurent's throat opened in lines so precise they looked surgical. This is Lord Magnus' preferred execution method. Enforcement Division records show 17 terminations using identical technique over the past 4 years. Magnus remained motionless in his seat, but something had shifted in his expression, the carefully constructed concern hardening into calculation. Kellen activated the screens again, showing grainy surveillance footage from the wine cellar. Timestamp: 11:35 p.m., 12 minutes before Laurent's scheduled inventory check. A figure in Enforcement Division uniform descended the stairs, moving with the fluid grace that marked vampire physiology. The footage quality was poor, deliberately so, but the build was unmistakable: broad shoulders, military posture, the kind of movement that suggested extensive combat training. Biometric analysis confirms the figure's gait pattern matches Victor Kane, Lord Magnus' personal assistant and senior enforcement agent. Kellen pulled up comparison footage showing Victor walking through the Obsidian Palace's main entrance earlier that evening, the movement patterns overlaying with 93% accuracy. Victor accessed the wine cellar using Enforcement Division override codes. He left 14 minutes later. Laurent arrived for inventory check at 11:47 p.m. and was dead within minutes. Lady Isadora leaned forward, her iron-gray hair catching the light. Lord Magnus, your assistant accessed a restricted area minutes before a murder using your signature method. Explain. Magnus' voice remained steady, but the edges had gone sharp. Victor conducts routine security sweeps of all palace facilities. His presence proves nothing beyond standard protocol. Then explain this. Kellen produced another document, chemical analysis showing molecular breakdown of the poison recovered from Lucien's wine glass. Bloodthorn poison requires master-level access to restricted substances. The compound is illegal under treaty law. Possession alone carries mandatory termination. Only 3 vampires in this city have authorization to requisition it for legitimate research purposes: Lord Lucien, Lord Magnus, and Chief Alchemist Helena Volkov. He pulled up requisition logs from the Alchemist's secure database, the kind of records that required multiple levels of encryption to access. Requisition dated 3 days ago. 5 milliliters of bloodthorn extract. Purpose listed as training purposes for Enforcement Division threat recognition. Signature, Magnus Thorn. The chamber exploded in voices. Vampire Lord stood. Human attendants stepped back from their positions, the careful order of conclave procedure fracturing under the weight of evidence that connected Magnus to both the poison and the executioner. Lord Chen's voice cut through the chaos with the precision of someone who'd survived vampire politics longer than most empires. This is not security protocol. This is internal purge. Lord Magnus requisitioned illegal poison, his assistant accessed the crime scene before the murder, and the victim was killed using Magnus' signature method. He looked at the elderly vampire lord who'd been moderating. The evidence is conclusive. The testimony stands verified. Lady Isadora stood, her movement commanding attention through sheer presence. Enforcement authority has been corrupted beyond its mandate. Lord Magnus has weaponized his position to eliminate witnesses to trafficking operations, murdered his own personnel to silence defection, and attempted assassination of the king to prevent exposure. She looked at Lord Dmitri, the isolationist who'd abstained. The conclave requires your vote. Evidence has been presented. Choose. Lord Dmitri rose slowly, his face carrying the kind of weariness that came from watching history repeat itself in predictable patterns. I vote against opposition. Lord Lucien's judgment, while perhaps compromised by human sympathy, remains preferable to Lord Magnus' demonstrated corruption. 7 votes for Magnus. 7 votes for Lucien. 1 vote that had just shifted the balance and created deadlock instead of resolution. Magnus stood with the kind of controlled fury that made the temperature in the chamber drop several degrees. Vampires radiated cold when they were losing control, ice replacing the careful mimicry of human warmth. Lord Lucien has been deceived by human manipulation. A waitress with no intelligence training has presented circumstantial evidence and emotional appeals. Victor's security sweep proves nothing. The requisition was legitimate research. Lawrence's death could have been committed by anyone with enforcement training. His voice carried through the chamber like a blade being drawn. Since evidence is disputed and votes are deadlocked, I invoke the ancient right of blood challenge. The silence that fell was absolute. Even the candles seemed to stop flickering, flames frozen in positions that defied physics. The elderly vampire lord's voice came out carefully measured. Lord Magnus. Blood challenge has not been invoked in this chamber for 140 years. You understand what you're requesting. Personal combat between accuser and accused. Single combat to first blood or submission. The winner's version of events becomes conclave fact, binding on all present. Magnus' eyes locked on Lucien with the kind of focus that preceded violence. If Lord Lucien believes I've committed treason, let him prove it with more than human testimony and convenient forensics. Let him prove it with his own blood. Tessa felt the blood mark on her throat flare hot, responding to Lucien's rage like a barometer measuring atmospheric pressure before a storm. She turned to see him standing at the chamber's edge, his carefully controlled expression fracturing into something ancient and predatory. Blood challenge supersedes all evidence presented, the elderly vampire lord said, looking at Lucien with something that might have been warning or regret. If you accept, the combat will determine truth regardless of documentation. If you refuse, the deadlock stands and we adjourn until evidence can be independently verified, a process that typically takes months during which Magnus retains his enforcement authority. Months of Magnus controlling the investigation into his own crimes. Months of witnesses disappearing. Months of Tessa's bloodmark fading and her protection evaporating while Magnus consolidated power. Lucien moved to the center of the chamber, stepping onto the judgment mirror beside Tessa. His reflection stared back from the polished glass, dark and absolute. I accept blood challenge. I'll prove your treason with your own blood, Magnus. And when you're bleeding on this floor, every vampire here will know exactly what you've done. Magnus smiled, the expression carrying nothing human in it. Then let's see if a king who's gone soft with human sympathies can still fight like a vampire. The elderly vampire lord raised both hands. Blood challenge has been invoked and accepted. Combat will commence immediately. Conclave will bear witness. The first to draw blood or force submission determines truth. He looked at both combatants with eyes that had probably witnessed more violence than Tessa could imagine. Prepare yourselves. This chamber becomes arena. Tessa stepped back from the judgment mirror as vampire attendants moved forward, clearing furniture, widening the circle of polished glass until it stretched 30 feet across. The blood mark on her throat pulsed with each of Lucien's heartbeats, if vampires had heartbeats, which she was starting to doubt, and she realized with sick clarity that she'd pushed for truth and gotten violence instead. Lady Isadora appeared beside her, guiding her to the spectator section with surprising gentleness. The evidence shifted votes, but it couldn't prevent this. Magnus knew he was losing and chose the only path that lets him win through strength instead of facts. She looked at Tessa with ancient eyes. Your testimony was brave. Now pray it wasn't fatal. The combat ring formed with brutal efficiency, vampire attendants dragging the judgment mirror clear of furniture until 30 feet of polished glass stretched across the conclave floor like a frozen lake waiting for blood to stain its surface. Magnus removed his midnight blue velvet coat with movements that looked ceremonial, revealing a body built for violence despite the aristocratic presentation, muscle coiled tight beneath pale skin, centuries of survival instinct coded into every gesture. Lucien shed his own jacket more slowly, and Tessa saw what she'd missed before, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, shoulders carrying weight that went beyond physical. 36 hours without rest. Without feeding, probably, which for vampires meant operating on reserves most humans couldn't comprehend. The elderly vampire lord raised one hand. Blood challenge begins at the fall of my palm. Combat continues until first submission or conclave intervention. Witnesses will remain silent unless addressing matters of protocol. His hand dropped. Magnus moved like water given predatory intent, closing the distance between them faster than Tessa's eyes could track. His first strike aimed for Lucien's throat, classic vampire kill technique. Go for the major arteries even though vampires didn't bleed out the way humans did. Lucien deflected with his forearm, redirecting momentum rather than meeting force with force, the kind of defensive fighting that suggested he was conserving energy he didn't have. They circled on the mirror's surface, footsteps silent on glass that reflected their movements with unsettling clarity. Magnus pressed forward with combinations that looked choreographed, centuries of combat experience flowing through strikes designed to wound rather than end quickly. His claws, when had his fingers become claws, raked across Lucien's shoulder, drawing 3 parallel lines that welled dark and immediate. First blood. The chamber held its breath. Yield, Magnus said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of challenge protocol. You've lost speed, lost edge. Yield and accept deposition with dignity. Lucien's hand pressed against his wounded shoulder, blood seeping between fingers. I refuse submission. Combat continues. Magnus' expression shifted into something that looked like grim duty, the face of someone doing necessary violence for the greater good. Then I'll prove my point more thoroughly. He attacked again, driving Lucian backward across the mirror's surface, each strike calculated to injure without killing, demonstrating superiority through controlled brutality. Tessa watched from the witness platform where Lady Isadora had positioned her, the blood mark on her throat pulsing in rhythm with what she could only assume was Lucian's distress. She testified to preserve truth and gotten violence instead, watched evidence shift votes only to have Magnus invoke combat that reduced everything to physical dominance. Her hands gripped the platform's edge hard enough that her knuckles went white. Magnus landed another strike, claws opening a line across Lucian's ribs. The Vampire King staggered, catching himself at the mirror's edge, and Magnus followed with the inevitability of tide coming in. His face remained set in that expression of grim necessity, the warrior doing unpleasant duty for his people's survival. But something was wrong. Tessa's eyes dropped to the judgment mirror beneath their feet, to the reflections moving across glass that was supposed to reveal truth. Magnus' reflected face showed something his actual expression didn't, lips pulled back in a vicious grin, eyes lit with triumph that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with personal victory. The reflection wasn't mimicking his controlled sorrow. It was showing what he actually felt. Look at the glass. Tessa's voice cut through the chamber before she could stop herself, before protocol or safety or common sense could override the need to make someone see what she was seeing. His reflection is smiling. 15 vampire lords turned their attention from the combat to the mirror beneath it. The judgment mirror that Kellen had explained was forged centuries ago to reflect truth during testimony, to show what witnesses were hiding beneath their words. The same mirror that apparently worked on combatants, showing Magnus' true face while his actual features maintained their mask of reluctant duty. Magnus' reflection grinned wider as he drove Lucian to his knees, showing teeth that looked more like weapons, eyes blazing with the kind of joy that came from watching an enemy break. The reflection showed him savoring every moment of Lucian's pain, revealed ambition and vicious pleasure where his actual face projected solemn necessity. The entire conclave saw it. The disconnect between Magnus' controlled expression and the truth the mirror threw back. Saw him enjoying this, saw the assassination attempt disguised as judicial combat, saw personal vendetta wrapped in the language of vampire sovereignty. Lady Isadora stood, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd watched enough political theater to recognize the real thing. The mirror has spoken. This is not justice administered through necessary combat. This is assassination performed for personal gain. She looked at the elderly vampire lord. The judgment mirror only reflects truth. Lord Magnus' reflection shows he's deriving pleasure from his king's suffering. This combat is void. It's not being conducted in service of vampire security, but in service of his own ambition. Lord Dimitri rose beside her, his isolationist caution breaking under evidence that couldn't be disputed or reframed. I break my abstention. Combat is void under ancient law. Violence performed for personal satisfaction rather than communal protection cannot determine conclave truth. He pointed at Magnus, whose actual face had finally shifted into something that matched his reflection, pure rage at being exposed. Magnus Thorne stands accused of treason by the glass itself. Magnus spun away from Lucian, his careful control shattering like the mirror beneath his feet, except the mirror didn't break, just kept reflecting his fury back at him with brutal honesty. A human tricks you with reflections and you abandon vampire hierarchy? She's manipulated this entire proceeding, used human emotional appeals to turn you against your own kind. He lunged across the combat ring, not at Lucian but at Tessa, claws extended, moving with the speed that had made him dangerous for 7 centuries. Tessa had 1 second to register the attack, 1 heartbeat to understand she was about to die regardless of blood marks or royal protection, before Silas materialized between them. The bodyguard caught Magnus' wrist mid-strike, redirecting momentum with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he'd stopped assassination attempts before. Magnus' claws raked empty air inches from Tessa's throat. Silas twisted, forcing Magnus to the ground, pinning him against the judgment mirror with one knee pressed between his shoulder blades. Attempted murder of royal witness during conclave proceedings, Silas said, his voice flat. That's treason regardless of any other charges. The elderly vampire lord's expression had gone from weary to granite. Conclave will vote on charges of treason, corruption of enforcement authority, trafficking of humans in violation of treaty law, assassination of vampire personnel, attempted assassination of the king, and attempted murder of protected witness. He looked at each lord in turn. Those in favor of stripping Magnus Thorne of all titles, enforcement authority, and exile beyond treaty borders. 11 hands rose. Magnus' original 6 supporters had fractured down to 4 diehards who probably had their own involvement in the trafficking operation to protect. Motion carries. Magnus Thorne is stripped of authority and exiled to territories beyond treaty jurisdiction. Enforcement Division will be placed under independent oversight pending investigation. The elderly vampire lord looked at Lucian, still bleeding on the mirror's edge. Lord Lucian Vale retains the crown. Secondary motion. Full investigation of all enforcement authorizations from the past decade, with independent verification of evidence. 9 hands rose this time. 6 lords opposed, probably calculating how many of their own operations might be exposed by independent oversight. But 9 was enough for majority. Tessa felt her legs give out, sitting hard on the witness platform while adrenaline drained away and left her shaking. She testified expecting to die and instead watched truth prevail through observation rather than violence, watched a system designed to protect vampire power forced to acknowledge its own corruption because a mirror couldn't lie. Lady Isadora appeared beside her again, offering a hand that Tessa took without thinking. The system begins accountability today because you refuse to stay silent. That's worth remembering when the nightmares come. Across the chamber, Silas hauled Magnus to his feet while enforcement agents appeared to process the exile. Magnus' reflection in the judgment mirror showed exactly what he was, a predator stripped of camouflage, fury and ambition laid bare by glass that had been forged centuries ago to reveal truth in a species that had perfected deception. Lucian limped toward Tessa, his wounds already beginning to close with the accelerated healing that made vampires hard to kill. "You saw what I missed," he said quietly. "You watched the reflection instead of the performance." "Elena taught me that," Tessa said, her voice steadier than she felt. "She said evidence doesn't lie if you know where to look for it." She touched the blood mark on her throat, feeling its pulse beginning to slow as immediate danger passed. She would have liked knowing the truth finally mattered more than who was powerful enough to bury it. 5 days after conclave, Tessa stood in the Obsidian Palace wine cellar where Laurent had died with his throat opened in 3 savage lines. Someone had cleaned the blood, replaced the disturbed bottles, restored order to a space designed for expensive vintages rather than murder. The restaurant operated normally overhead. She could hear the muffled rhythm of dinner service through the ceiling, servers moving through their choreography while the vampire political world restructured itself in ways most humans would never notice. Lucian descended the stairs with the careful movements of someone whose wounds had healed, but whose body remembered them anyway. He carried a leather folder embossed with the royal seal, the kind of official documentation that usually preceded life-changing pronouncements. The conclave voted this morning on reform measures. Independent oversight of Enforcement Division, mandatory review of all authorizations from the past decade, human representation in treaty violation proceedings. He placed the folder on a wine barrel between them. They also voted to create a permanent position, Royal Witness. Human voice in vampire legal proceedings. The role comes with protections, salary, access to classified materials relevant to human-vampire relations. Tessa touched the blood mark on her throat, still glowing silver blue after 5 days when it should have started fading. You're offering me a job testifying against vampires who abuse the system? I'm offering you the authority to investigate abuses Elena found and prevent future ones. The position reports directly to Conclave Oversight Committee, not to me. Independence is built into the role. You'd have access to files I can't legally prevent you from examining. He opened the folder, revealing documentation that made Tessa's breath catch. These are Elena's encrypted files, recovered from Magnus' private server after his exile. 47 documents detailing trafficking routes, payments, safe houses across 6 states. Everything she found before they killed her. Tessa's hands trembled as she pulled the files closer, seeing her roommate's meticulous documentation, spreadsheets tracking transport dates, photographs of shipping manifests, bank records showing wire transfers to offshore accounts. Elena had built a case that could dismantle an operation spanning multiple states, and she'd done it alone in their apartment while Tessa worked night shifts serving vampires who probably knew exactly what was happening. Did you suspect Magnus before tonight? The question came out harder than she'd intended. Lucien's expression carried the weight of someone who'd spent 5 days reviewing his own failures. I knew the numbers didn't match the narrative. 28 terminations in 2 years when the previous decade averaged 12. I should have questioned it. Should have demanded independent verification before signing authorizations. I didn't because I trusted the system I built to work without constant supervision. He paused. I should have acted sooner. Elena would be alive if I'd bothered to look at the patterns instead of the individual cases Magnus presented. Tessa thought about 2 years spent carrying guilt for not knocking a champagne glass out of Elena's hand, for not asking questions when official rulings didn't make sense, for choosing silence because it felt safer than making noise. Thought about how many people were alive because they'd never asked inconvenient questions, and how many were dead because someone finally did. I'll accept the position, she said, her voice steady. But I have a condition. The blood mark becomes permanent, but it doesn't tie to your throne, it ties to the office itself. And I retain the right to publish Elena's findings in the human world, not just vampire legal proceedings. The humans who were trafficked deserve to know their government failed to protect them. The families of the 9 people Magnus murdered deserve answers that don't disappear behind classified treaty protocols. Something shifted in Lucien's expression, not surprise, exactly, but recognition of someone who'd learned the same lessons he had about power and accountability. Permanent mark that ties to the office rather than the king. Independent authority to publish findings in human and vampire jurisdictions. He nodded once. Conclave will approve it. Lady Isadora has been pushing for human oversight mechanisms since before I took the throne. You'll be the test case for whether accountability can work across species lines. The ritual took place in the wine cellar because Tessa refused to do it anywhere sanitized or ceremonial. If she was committing to permanent visibility, to becoming a walking target for every vampire who preferred the old system of convenient murders and buried evidence, she wanted to do it in the place where Laurent had tried to defect and died for it. Where witnesses were silenced and bodies were discovered too late. Lucien used the same silver needle, the same mixture of blood and powdered metal, but this time the invocation was different. Not protection granted by a king, but authority granted by an office that would outlast any individual ruler. The needle traced the same crescent pattern on her throat, but when it finished, the mark transformed from silver blue to gold, glowing with light that looked like molten sun instead of frozen moon. It's more visible, Lucien said, studying the mark with clinical attention. Silver blue could be hidden under makeup, passed off as unusual jewelry in certain light. Gold broadcasts itself. Every vampire who sees you will know immediately what you represent. Human authority in vampire spaces, accountability given physical form. Tessa touched the gold crescent, feeling heat instead of ice, feeling weight that went beyond physical sensation. The mark no longer pulsed with Lucien's presence. It had its own heartbeat now, independent and relentless. Good. Let them see me coming. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, Unusual because she'd changed her number 3 times since Conclave, given the new contact information only to Silas and Kellen for security purposes. The message came from an unknown sender, encrypted text that appeared and began counting down from 5 seconds the moment she opened it. Your roommate wasn't the first legal aid. She was number 8. I have files on the other 7, and the network extends to Europe. They'll come for you next. A friend who wants to stay alive. The message deleted itself at 0, disappearing from her phone like it had never existed. Tessa stared at the blank screen, her mind cataloging implications faster than her fear could catch up. Elena was the 8th legal aid killed for investigating Enforcement Division operations. 7 others before her, murdered and buried under official explanations that no one questioned because questioning felt dangerous. And the trafficking network extended beyond Magnus, beyond the city, into territories where treaty law got complicated and oversight became theoretical. Lucien saw her expression shift. What happened? Someone just told me Elena was number 8. There are files on 7 other legal aids killed for investigating the same operation. And the network extends to Europe. She looked up from her phone, the gold mark on her throat blazing brighter. Magnus wasn't running this alone. We exiled one conspirator and thought we'd solve the problem, but we just cut off one branch of something that has roots across multiple continents. The wine cellar suddenly felt smaller, the restored order around her looking fragile instead of permanent. Magnus was gone, but the system that had protected him remained, built by vampires who'd had centuries to perfect the art of making problems disappear before anyone noticed they existed. Tessa picked up Elena's files, sliding them into the leather case Lucien had brought, documentation of 47 transports that represented just one city's operation in a network that apparently spanned from the United States to Europe. 7 more names to uncover. 7 more legal aids whose families deserved to know they'd been murdered by the government they'd trusted to protect them. 7 more investigations that would make her a target for vampires who preferred witnesses to stay conveniently dead. She climbed the cellar's stairs carrying the case like a weapon, left the Obsidian Palace through the service entrance she'd used for 3 years as an invisible waitress, and drove to the cemetery where Elena was buried under a headstone that listed her death as tragic accident at public event. The gold mark glowed in the moonlight as Tessa opened her laptop on the grass beside her roommate's grave. She pulled up a blank document and began typing testimony that would be published in human newspapers and vampire legal records simultaneously. Documentation that couldn't be disappeared or explained away because it would exist in too many places for convenient silence. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you found, Tessa said to the gravestone, her voice steady in the darkness. 7 more names. 47 documented transports. A network that extends to Europe. They'll come for me, but that just means I'm asking the right questions. She touched the gold crescent on her throat, feeling its independent heartbeat pulse against her fingertips. You taught me that evidence doesn't lie if you know where to look for it. So watch me. I'm going to look everywhere until there's nowhere left for them to hide. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.